Hello and welcome to Tank and AFV News. My name's Tom, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about tank gun barrel diameters. Specifically, there was a video put out over the weekend by Forgotten Weapons. It's an excellent channel, and instead of looking at small arms like they usually do, they looked at a late model Sherman tank with a 76mm gun, and this video was done in conjunction with the Chieftain from World of Tanks, who has his own channel, which is also an excellent channel. And I would highly recommend the video if anybody wants to watch it, because they actually fire all the weapons on it and show you how they operate, which is pretty fantastic, because they're one of those places where you can essentially rent a tank and drive it around and fire the weapons and all that stuff for a substantial amount of money. But there was one part in the video that struck me as incorrect. And then I talked to a friend, and he's like, yeah, that jumped out at me too. And I'm like, okay, well, I think it's worth pointing out. And so I'm going to just play the clip right now.
So I want to clear something up, and that is 75mm, 76mm. They're actually the exact same bore, right?
I believe they are, yeah.
This seems like it's like a 38 357 Magnum sort of thing. This gun, the 76, has a larger case, case capacity, higher pressure, higher velocity, and it's the higher velocity that makes it more effective against enemy armor.
Correct.
The old 75 is effectively the exact same sort of projectile, but
travels slower.
Less powder, less velocity, slower, less effective against armor.
It's mass by velocity squared, if I recall, is the formula.
So the idea in naming this a 76
was to make sure it didn't get mixed up with the 3-inch.
Which was also 75mm in diameter, but using yet a different case that wasn't interchangeable.
Correct. Okay. And so you had to mark it 76 to make sure that you didn't get 76mm ammunition show up at an M10 tank destroyer unit.
All right, well, he's incorrect. 75mm, 75mm, and then the 76mm gun is a different bore. It's actually 3-inch. It's 76.2mm. And I think what the confusion is that there were a number of different guns with different names that were all actually 3-inch guns. In U.S. service, you have both the 76mm gun and the 3-inch gun. So the 3-inch gun from the M10 tank destroyer and the M6 heavy tank. You have the 76mm gun that's on the late model Shermans. It's on the Hellcat tank destroyer. Those guns are both 76.2mm. Then also in Allied service on the British end, you've got the 17-pounder, which is a 3-inch gun, and you've got the 77mm on the Comet cruiser, which is not 77mm, it's 76.2. So you've got a whole bunch of different guns that are 3-inch. And I like to say 3-inch because it's obviously that's the origin of the caliber. Like, nobody would sit around and arbitrarily pull 76.2mm out of the air when they said, let's make a 3-inch gun. And so that's how that size that diameter got established. It was a naval gun that got adopted into Army service. So that brings to mind the question, why would the U.S. Army have a 75mm gun and a 76.2mm gun? I mean, when they're so close in size, why not standardize one caliber or the other? And the reason for that has to do for historical reasons, not because somebody in the Ordnance Department decided to have a bunch of different gun calibers that were really close to each other. It has to do with World War One. And the French Revolution, to a certain extent, because after the French Revolution, the French Republic, they standardized on metrics. Most of Europe standardized on metric. Of course, the English and the Americans, we stuck with imperial or English or whatever you want to call it. So that's why all of us, when we go repair something, you're sitting there trying to get your half inch wrench on a 13mm nut, and it's a pain in the butt, and it's one of those things that's just a factor of modern life in the United States. There's two different measurement systems that you never know who's using what. So when the U.S. Army in World War One says, hey, we need equipment, and most of our designs are obsolete, we need to rely on our allies for stuff. One of the first things they do is adopt the French 75mm field gun, which is a revolutionary gun when it came out. And it's 75mm, because for the French, that makes total sense. 75, it's a nice round number. Hey. So that's how that got into the U.S. Army arsenal. And that gun stuck around, and by the time of World War II, the M2 and M3 guns that equipped the M3 tank and the M4 Sherman, it's a 75mm gun. Now, it's not the same gun as the old French gun, but it does fire the same family of ammunition, so it's derived from that old French gun. So that's how 75 millimeter gets into the mix. Now the British also would end up with 75 millimeter in their tank arsenal with the QF 75 because, frankly, they needed a gun that could chuck some He rounds, and instead they had the 6-pounder, so they ended up just sort of reboring that thing and coming up with a very similar weapon that could fire the 75 millimeter family of ammunition, but still sort of fit on all the 6-pounder mountings. So that's what went to the later Churchills and the Cromwells and whatnot. So 75 millimeter sort of snuck into the inventories of the countries that didn't actually use metrics for the most metric system for measuring their gun diameters, and it's, like I said, it has more to do with just sort of practical reasons than any sort of intentional decisions made about particular gun calibers. Now, why did the 76.2 millimeter guns or the 3-inch guns get all those different names? Mostly just to differentiate them. I mean, it doesn't actually matter if the troops are calling the gun something that it actually isn't. Okay? As long as it's just a uniform way of identifying the gun. And so it was important to differentiate the 3-inch gun on the M10 from the 76 millimeter gun that's on the M18 because they're firing the same diameter of projectile, but it's not the same shell. The shell casings are different. Same with the British situation with the 17-pounder and the 77 millimeter. The 17-pounder is a rather long shell case. It's not the easiest thing to handle inside of a tank. And so for the Comet, they realized that it wasn't going to be a practical thing to put in the turret, so they modified it a bit, shortened the case a bit, and said, well, it's still shooting the same projectile as the 17-pounder, but it is a different shell. We don't want the troops to get confused, so we'll just call it the 77 millimeter, even though it's not an accurate title. So that's the story of the different 3-inch guns that were on Allied tanks, and they are different than the 75 millimeter guns. And like I said, it's just historical reasons going back to certain countries are metric and certain ones are not. And then you throw in the British with the pounder system, which is by World War II standards completely archaic. All these things get confusing, and and then with the Germans as well. They're using metric, but they almost always use centimeters. So it's a 7.5 centimeter. If you're in France, it's a 75 millimeter. So everybody does things a little different. And, I thought about this a while back because I remember at a forum at one point somebody asked, why do certain caliber or certain barrel diameters get chosen? And very seldom does that get discussed. It's usually just sort of like, well, this country decided to develop a 75 millimeter gun. Okay, well, why did they pick that? Like, why not an 8 centimeter gun? Why not, I thought it would make an interesting topic, but as I started to dig into it, I could find so little actually answering those specific questions of why, and usually you could find out, well, this particular diameter just had been around before, so they just kept using it. So obviously you're going to, if it means you don't have to buy new barrel boring equipment, you're not going to arbitrarily change sizes. Although we do see, there's certain, like, for example, why 7.5 centimeter was so common amongst German gun design in World War II when it was not terribly common in World War I. World War I, their standard field gun was 7.7 centimeters. So, and 7.7 disappears completely by World War II as a gun barrel diameter. So, why? I don't know. If somebody knows, I'd love to know, because part of the reason I make these videos is because aside from sort of sharing what I discover, I want to know what other people think. So if anybody has an idea, the only sort of gun caliber, barrel diameter that I found specifically tied to a reason is 37 millimeter. Now, of course, 37 millimeter is a very common caliber size for World War II tank guns, early in the war at least. And it goes back to the old, sort of at the end of the 19th century, the Hague Convention, and sort of where they tried to establish these rules for warfare. And one of the rules was they said that 1 pound was the lightest you could make an explosive projectile. So they didn't want people making explosive, essentially small arms rounds. That was thought to be inhumane for some reason. It's okay to blow somebody to bits with a 3-inch field artillery piece, but my God, if you use an exploding bullet, that's wrong. So the rules they used to come up with are they seem sort of silly in retrospect as we look at them, but you know, people thought about this stuff seriously back then. So they had that rule. So 37 millimeter was sort of judged to be the smallest caliber you could get and still meet that 1 pound requirement. And so you see it used, you know, in I think the oldest is like the British had like a 1 pound pom-pom gun that Maxim developed. But then during World War One, you see a bunch of different countries develop 37 millimeter infantry guns. So they want something as small as possible, but can still shoot an explosive round. You know, it's supposed to be a light infantry cannon, something that the guys can carry themselves, take out machine gun nests and whatnot. And those become pretty common, and then they end up also becoming tank armament. The French 37 millimeter being on the Renault FT. So, you know, the most successful tank of World War One really has got a 37 millimeter gun, and that I think really sort of established that caliber as a pretty standard one. And obviously you see people develop more and more guns in that size, and so I think it's, you know, like I say, I there's very little written. Nobody really documents it saying specifically like, well, you know, when the Germans decide to develop an anti-tank gun, they go 37 millimeter. Well, are they copying the French? Is it just sort of considered, well, we know that that's an acceptable size for an explosive round according to the Hague rules? Who knows? You know, most of the sources just say, oh, they just picked this size and no particular reasons given. So, but that was the one little thing I did find. With 37 millimeter, you can trace it back to that sort of Hague convention rule about sort of downward weight limitations for explosive projectiles. As far as other guns, you know, I think it's just, for the most part, you pick round numbers. So, you know, if you measure stuff in inches, it just makes sense. Like, you have a 5-inch gun, a 3-inch gun, 2-inch, whatever. So, and then, you know, the world converts to metric, and all of a sudden you have to convert it, and you end up with really bizarre numbers like 76.2. So, anyhow, so that was all I really had to say on that. Again, not putting this out there to criticize the Forgotten Weapons video so much as just sort of make a correction, because I really I think their videos are good enough to warrant talking about. Okay, I mean, I could spend hours and hours trying to correct everything wrong I see that's put out there about tanks on the internet. I mean, national interest articles alone would take a lifetime to correct. But with Forgotten Weapons stuff and with what the Chieftain does, everything they do so good that when something is an error, it really sort of jumps out at you, because that's really uncommon, and I really highly recommend their stuff. So yeah, that's about it. If people are interested in further reading on this topic of U.S. and British tank guns, just to plug a book, Dick Taylor's Firing Now. This one came out, I don't know, a year or two ago, maybe a little longer. And it is, it's not a cheap book. I was able to get a used copy a little cheaper, because these Green Series books are not the cheapest for what they are, but it's really good, and I've really enjoyed everything that Dick Taylor has written. I don't really know anything about him other than just the books of his that I have, I think are well worth having. So, little plug there for an author I like, and yeah, we'll catch you on the next one.